So I think we already have a few people in here. I think we definitely have one school class here. So welcome everyone. I hope everyone else will join us in a minute, but I will start with my introduction, and I think everyone will be here as soon as we get into the topics. So hello everyone, and welcome to our event, The Future of NATO. My name is Katrin Büttner, and I am coordinating the school programs at the DAC, that's the German American Center in Stuttgart. And I will give you a quick overview of today's event first. So first, I would like to tell you a little bit about the DAC for everyone who doesn't know us yet. We are a cultural and educational institution that focuses on transatlantic relationships, dialogue, and exchange. This event today is part of our school program, in which we offer various presentations, workshops, teacher trainings, and other events about American history, politics, and culture throughout the year. So if you're interested in joining us for anything else, just check out our website. You will find more programs like this one there. For students, I just want to mention that real quick. We also offer language courses during the vacations, including preparation for the Abitur, but also for other grades. So if you're interested, you can find these information also on our website, of course. And one more thing to mention, because that might be interesting for the students listening as well. We are also part of the Education USA network, and we advise teenagers and young adults on educational opportunities in the US and provide them with unbiased information. And it's also for free, our services. So if you are interested in doing an au pair or volunteering or studying in the US, you can always contact us and get more information, and we are happy to help you. So I am glad to be hosting today's event in cooperation with the Landeszentrale für politische Bildung, who cannot be here today, unfortunately, and the former members of Congress. I want to thank the former members of Congress for putting this together and bringing us in touch with Senator Carol Moseley Brown, who is already here today. Welcome. We're so happy to have you. And thank you for doing this program with us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And we will also be joined by Congressman, I think it is. So he was a member of the House of Representatives, Congressman Dennis Ross. He will join us a little later. He will be here at around 2:30 German time, and go into the discussion with us then. So just to let you know what's going to happen later. And I, of course, would like to welcome Jacob Sopiars, who will guide you through the event today and will also give the lecture on NATO later. Jacob is a former high school teacher in the United States who has lived in Stuttgart for, I think, over 3 years now. And he currently works for a sales organization, I think. Is that correct still?
Yeah.
Good.
Still got it, yeah.
And during his time in Stuttgart, he has participated in several events with the DATS. He has also moderated other discussions with former members of Congress, but he is also presenting within the America Explained program, where he's currently giving the presentations on gun control and on St. Louis. So that's a little bit on his background. And before we start, I also want to give you a quick overview of the event today. As I said, you'll first hear a 30-minute presentation by Jacob, in which he gives an overview of the history, future, and current challenges of NATO. And at 2:30, former member, that's Republican Representative Dennis Ross, will join us. And so we don't know exactly when they will be here. So I hope the transition goes smoothly, but I just want to warn you that it might get a little chaotic in between. the students in the classrooms or at home, you are not able to turn on your microphones or cameras, but you can ask questions by using the Q&A tool. So you have to type the questions or submit the questions in written form, but I really want to encourage everyone to send in lots of questions at any time during the event concerning the presentation, and of course questions for the former members, because we will have enough time to answer a lot of them, and we really want to get into the topics you are interested in. So let us know what you want to talk about, and we are more than happy to do that. And on this note, I'm handing it over to you, Jacob. Thank you so much for being here today and doing this again.
Of course. So excited, Catherine. Thanks for having me. So excited to get a chance to talk to former Senator Ms. Braun and former Congressman Mr. Ross. Students, I have roughly 22 minutes before we hit that 8:30 mark, but I was tasked with the responsibility of just briefly going over NATO and where we came from, how we've gotten here, some of the current challenges. And so I'm going to try to do that as quickly but as informatively as possible, because the real stars of the show today are our former senator and former congressman. But I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to reiterate what Catherine said. These are great if you all ask questions. And, so please use the Q&A function. You can ask questions during my little spiel here for the next 20 minutes, but keep them coming in as I try to facilitate a conversation at that 8:30 time frame as well. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to make this as entertaining as I possibly can over Zoom and make a connection with all of you, as much as I wish I was inside of the classroom. So let's just jump in, and we'll go from there. Okay. So to reiterate what Catherine said, my name is Jacob. I'm a former high school teacher, and ironically enough, former Senator Ms. Braun, who's on the call today, she's from Chicago, Illinois, and I am also from Illinois. I'm from a small town just east of St. Louis, but I think most of you students on the call will know where Chicago is at. You may not be able to know where St. Louis is. I taught U.S. history and world geography in junior and senior level classes at the high school that I taught at. So I was really excited to jump into this topic today. Catherine, I had a little slide here on some of the DAZ programs, but you covered most of this. For the students that are listening here today, check these out. It's really great. And my cooperation with the DAZ since I've been here, I can't speak highly enough about it. And I always call out the library that they have there. Really, really great collection of different books, media stuff as well. And I know that they're doing as best as they can to help prepare you, all of you, for your, I'm going to call them your finals. I know that that's not the right word, but Catherine covered most of these things that the DAZ does. In terms of the presentation today, I'm so excited because I really got to steal from a presentation that I used in my classroom. This is a topic that we discuss a lot in my U.S. history courses back when I taught, and we're going to jump into the future of NATO. And so again, presented by the DAZ and their American Explain program and for schools. Let's go. Here we go. We're going to start from the beginning. All right. So bear with me here. I know sometimes when we go backwards in time, it can get not as interesting as what's going on currently, but it's really, really important that we try to understand where NATO came from. I'm going to apologize in advance because I think I will probably give more of a US-based perspective here, but that's how I'm comfortable speaking about this particular topic. And I wanted to start here. Okay, so we have to go all the way back, students, end of World War II. Mid-1940s, 1945, 1946, and when something became known as the Truman Doctrine. At that particular time, Harry Truman is the US president. I stole a newspaper clipping from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. That's where I lived for a few years back in the US. And you'll notice here at the top of the newspaper clipping, the US must stop red spread. And there's a bunch of different topics listed on this headline around stopping the spread of communism. Harry Truman at the time initially adopted a policy circled around this idea that we have to stop the spread of communism. For all my students here, you know what happened at the end of World War II. We have the split from East and West Germany, and the United States is legitimately living in fear of the spread of communism. I was going to post some of the magazine articles and some of the political cartoons of the time, but there's a legitimate fear that communism is going to spread not only into the rest of Europe, but even into the United States. We don't have to get into all that, but it became a policy of what referred to as containment. That's why I put that on there. It's about containing the spread of communism. The reason I bring this up is because the United States at that particular time will then work with a few countries already in Western Europe who have formed alliances. The Treaty of Brussels gets passed. That includes Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK. They all come together following World War II, and they say we have to help each other in the event of a Soviet spread into Western Europe. And so they had this Brussels Treaty that came about right after World War II. The US steps in and gives a little bit of power to this. The US is seen as sort of a military power at that particular time. And what we do is we align with those countries, and this will essentially put in place two alliances. I don't think I'm being over exaggerant here, that will change the course of history. The first one is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The second one is the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or what I'm sure most of you would know as the Warsaw Pact, that will happen. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization starts in 1949. 12 countries are initially a part of NATO. Again, the idea at this particular time, it's around containment. We want to stop communism from spreading, not only in Western Europe. There's some concerns about Asia and the Pacific, but we're not going to jump into that for this lecture today. I listed the countries here: Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. What will happen is, I included a quote here from Harry Truman as soon as we signed NATO. He said, "In this pact, we hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression. It's a bulwark which will permit us to get on with the real business of government and society, a business of achieving a fuller and happier life for all of our citizens." This is coming from Harry Truman at the time, as soon as he signs the agreement with these other countries. Well, if you can imagine, students out there, the Soviet Union's not real happy about this when NATO gets passed. And particularly, there's one article of NATO that is still very prevalent and important today. And really, if you walk out of here with anything, students, I'm assuming most of you probably already know this, but if you walk out of here with anything, Article 5 of the NATO agreement is the most important. And Article 5 states that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. So really, when NATO was formed, it's a military alliance. Not so much political in the very beginning, more military. If something happens with the Soviet Union attacking one of these countries, you're going to get the full support of all the other members of NATO. Okay. The Soviet Union responds. It takes a little while. Okay. So NATO gets passed in 1949. The Soviet Union comes in 1955 and will create what's referred to as the Warsaw Pact. It includes the Soviet Union, a few Eastern European countries: Albania, Bulgaria, at the time Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. And so when I taught this in the US for all the German students here today, we typically refer to this as the Iron Curtain. So the Iron Curtain fell onto Europe, and it really became a West versus East alliance inside of Europe. And that, in short, gets to the point around what happened at the start of the forming of NATO and where it came from. You have to go back to the end of World War II. There's a legitimate fear of the spread of communism. What I think is important now is we look through the years. So brief, what has happened with NATO since that initial formation in 1949? One word I think describes it best is growth. Growth. So I included a map here for all of you students, but if you look, NATO has gradually continued to add more members since the original 12. You have Greece and Turkey are added in 1952. West Germany will play a huge role in this when they are added to NATO in 1955. If you can sense the timeline here, Germany gets added to NATO in 1950. West Germany gets added to NATO in 1955. And that spring, the Warsaw Pact is signed. So, the Soviet Union's nervous about a strengthened West Germany and what that may mean for East Germany and the rest of the Soviet countries at that particular time. But they add Spain in 1982. We're in 2022 up to 30 countries that are a part of NATO. I'm going to talk a little bit because this is a topic for debate potentially a little bit later, but there's two more that were just added to that list. So we talk about growth through the years. NATO has grown a lot since its original conception. As you all know, the Soviet Union is no longer around, right? So as NATO has continued to grow since the fall of the Soviet Union, big difference, right? Growth in NATO, shrinking of what now we would refer to as Russia's impact. I included this here because one thing that also has happened through the years is that NATO was initially established, as I mentioned earlier, as a defense mechanism. If a country is attacked, the other countries come to their aid. I included this because what does defense look like over the years? And I think that I put the word defense in quotes because I think that some would argue potentially that when you look at what defense looks like in 2022, this graph or this little image that I found from the NATO website includes how many troops and what type of support are added to all the countries here, some of these former Soviet Union countries, but certainly those that border Russia today, right? So when you look at this, you have 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, 130 Allied aircraft at high alert, 100,000 US troops deployed to Europe, 140 Allied ships at sea. So again, thinking from 1949 until 2022, growth in the number of countries has also meant sort of a different perception of what defense means to a certain degree. I included another one here because this list looks at the air domain in NATO and how we're butting up against Russia. This lists the specific aircraft that are being provided in different countries. And the stat that stuck out to me here, you have around 30 Allied surveillance and fighter jets that are in the air at any one time in 2022. And so when you talk about the growth of NATO, it's growth not only in the number of countries that have been added, but obviously growth in our military presence, our legitimate presence as a military alliance as well. That brings me to our number 3, which I think we're going to talk with former Senator Ms. Braun and Mr. Ross today. There's a few things that are up for debate as it relates to some NATO and some of the topics. So I wanted to throw a couple in here to see if I could get you students to jump in, maybe if you have some questions. The first one, you actually have to go back. NATO is not just being debated in 2022. You got to go back a little bit further. This has been a debate since I put a picture here. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall. As soon as the wall fell in Berlin, people were already asking what should happen with NATO. The Soviet Union will collapse a couple years later after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but even at that point, people were asking, well, what happens with NATO now? There's no more Soviet Union. So do we need NATO anymore? Is there any more fear of this? And so that debate came about, in the early 90s, late 1980s, the debate of should NATO stay or should it go? If you move forward a little bit, this is the largest piece of the conversation that we'll talk to both of our former senator and former congressman, who it looks like just joined. We're going to chat with them a little bit about this here in just a few minutes. It's the conversation around enlargement. So adding all these countries has not come with debate for NATO. Then there's a case here, so I'm going to play the middleman here. There's a case for and a case against this. So the people that are arguing for the enlargement of NATO, they're saying things around, hey, these are prevention of conflict, stabilization of like-minded democratic nations. Better to have a strong NATO in place than to rush a counter against an expanding Russia, right? You have the other side of the argument, though, too. The case against the enlargement of NATO, which is more countries makes it more political. Go back to when NATO was founded. This was a military alliance, not so much a political one. You have Article 5, the coming to defense of another country is more diluted the more countries you get into it. Is extending to some countries, diminishing the security of others. It costs money. We'll talk about this a little bit, but for our German students, I'm stationed, my wife works here in Stuttgart. There was a big talk a couple of years ago because there was some relocation of some troops and some specific buildings that were located here in Stuttgart that were going to be moved elsewhere. Also, this argument maybe doesn't alienate Russia. So, when we talk about the hot topics for debate, this is a big one. Then we'll talk about this here in just a few minutes. I also wanted to throw this in here because I think it is important. I know well enough students, I've talked to enough of you that Trump is something I get a lot of questions about when I go into German high schools. And so I want to just quickly put this out there. When Trump was president, there was a more heightened debate around the US involvement in NATO. And so these aren't my words, I just pulled these from a few articles that were around the time. The first one, Trump doubles request for NATO defense, calls Germany a captive of Russia. This one is interesting. This is a most recent article posted last week by The Atlantic that said there's an accidental Trumpification of NATO. And the second one was Trump discussed pulling US from NATO. Aide says, new concerns over Russia. I will tell you, I'll ask former Senator Ms. Braun and former Representative Mr. Ross about this, get their thoughts on this. But this was definitely highlighted and I think warned by President Trump at the time, but has certainly become a matter of discussion. It wasn't just him that was questioning these things. He was just someone that very much so was more outspoken about it, particularly in going against some of the larger members of NATO. So we'll talk about this a little bit, but certainly another topic for us to discuss. Wouldn't be, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. What is happening currently in Ukraine has obviously then led to discussions around NATO. And if you go back to some of the for and against the enlargement of NATO, this becomes very prevalent. I wanted just to mention a few things here. And then, man, look at me. It's like I've done this before, Catherine, right on time. We're going to turn it over to our former senator and former congressman. But with Ukraine, I wanted to mention this. What has happened here? The first thing that I wanted to mention that has happened, there was just a conference in Madrid. NATO countries came together to discuss. The first thing that happened is Finland and Sweden applied for membership into NATO. All right, so if you read about this, students, you're going to hear about NATO pushing north. And this would make 32 countries that would potentially be a part of the NATO agreement. The second thing is they upped troop readiness, is how they refer to that. They now have 300,000 troops to high readiness alert, those NATO troops I just showed you on the map. The third thing is the stance on Russia changed, the specific verbiage. Once listed as a strategic partner is now listed as a direct threat. And so what the situation Ukraine has, I think, brought forward for debate and for conversation is, obviously Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So if you're wondering why troops have not been deployed there yet, that certainly is a big portion of that conversation, but there has been aid. And the US has been a part of that. Germany recently, with the situation in the Ukraine, had to figure out what they were going to do with their supply of natural gas and oil that was initially run through from Russia. And so Ukraine, I think, has heightened this conversation, what's happened there and what's going on. And again, I'll try to ask our former senator and former congressman about this as we go. All right. I want to make sure I didn't miss any Q&As. I didn't. Students, that's a 25-minute overview of NATO. Okay. So I don't want you to, I think that I'm glossing over some key things, but I think it's important before we jump into the conversation that we have an idea about this, where NATO came from, some of the challenges and the debate that's in place now in 2022. And my hope is here we'll get some interesting perspectives from our guests that are here. Katrin, I think I'm 3 minutes early, but if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and transition to that portion of it. So I just want to quickly introduce who we have here again. All right, so we'll start with Miss Carol Moseley Braun. She served as a U.S. Senator from Illinois from 1993 to 1999. She was the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. Senate. She served as the Senate Judiciary Committee under the leadership of Joe Biden. 2004 had a nomination for president, I believe, too, if my history serves me right. So Miss Senator Carol Moseley Braun, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
And the second invite person I need to introduce is Mr. Dennis Allen Ross. Mr. Ross served in the United States House of Representatives from 2011 to 2019. He is a Republican from Florida. You'll have to check me here, Mr. Ross. I think you actually, if you check the books, were with the 12th Congressional, but then that moved to the 15th Congressional.
Correct.
Inside
Correct.
Florida. So he served for the 12th for 2 years, the 15th for the last 6 when he was in Congress. And now I believe, if my LinkedIn research serves me right, serves as the director of the American Center for Political Leadership at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida. So
Yes, sir, Jacob, and thank you. It's a pleasure
thank you
to be
so much
here.
for being here. Thank you so much. Before we jump into the NATO stuff, we won't dive into there first. I wanted to give you both an opportunity just to tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, maybe where you came from, how you got into politics. And so, Ms. Braun, if you would start off, I think that'd be a great place for us to get the conversation going. Just a little about yourself, how you got to where you are.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Congressman, it's nice to meet you for the
Likewise.
first time. And to the students, I'm delighted to join this conversation this morning. I'm a member of the former members of FMC, former members of Congress, and they asked me if I participate, and I'm happy to do that. I was telling Jacob and Catherine this morning that early in my career, when I was probably not much older than you are, I was picked up by the European Community Visitors Program. And it literally shaped my life and my decisions thereafter. I traveled throughout Europe, and it was a real eye-opener for a girl from the south side of Chicago. So that was my first introduction. And quite frankly, that gave me my perspective on a lot of these issues that abides with me today. Let me say, I'm from the south side of Chicago. I'm one of 4 children. And my father was a police officer. My mother was a medical technician. I grew up, I went to the public schools in the main, but I did go to some private schools later, Catholic schools particularly. And then I went and got my undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois, and went further and got my law degree from the University of Chicago. You can say I'm a real Illinois-centric person. And then after my law degree, I became a federal prosecutor. I became a assistant United States attorney. And then after that, that's when my political career kind of got started. I hadn't intended to go into politics. I frankly had wanted to be an art historian, but my father dissuaded me from doing that on the grounds that I couldn't make a living as an art historian. So it's like, okay, fine, whatever. So he had always wanted to be a lawyer. He was a police officer himself, and he always wanted to be a lawyer. So that was the natural thing for me to fall into, and I did. And so then from there, I began to get involved with community issues. And because I got involved with community issues, that led to a political career. Again, I hadn't intended to be a politician, but it just happened. And I'm glad it did, because quite frankly, it's been quite the adventure, quite the ride. And I sound like I'm about to die. I hope I'm not going to, God willing, but I'm still here and still functioning. I'm now, I call myself flunking retirement. That is to say, I'm theoretically retired, but I'm working as hard as ever now with all the different volunteer activities I'm involved with. Among those activities is serving as an advisor to the World War I Commission. And I wanted to say this, Jacob, and I don't know, I hope I'm not interfering with or contradicting your presentation in any way, but my view is that the real origins of NATO came about as a result of World War I.
Yeah.
World War I transformed our lives in ways that we don't really think about. And if you think back, if you know your history at all, the First World War started really with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Serbia. He was assassinated. He and his wife were both killed. And what happened thereafter was like dominoes. All the different countries in Europe lined up based on who their friends were. And it started the first global conflict. It was called the Great War because it was the first big war in which everybody was involved. And it literally did consume the entire planet, basically. And because it was so haphazard and nobody could really figure out why this war had happened, I think that was residual. That was in the back of the minds of the people who started NATO literally a generation later, because the Second World War came on the heels of the First World War. We hadn't really answered all the problems that the First World War had raised, including these bizarre alliances that didn't make much sense, but that gave rise to a conflict that engulfed the entire world. There was hardly a country on the planet that was not involved with the First World War, and it really shaped a lot of different things. It set up the 20th century in ways that we are still beginning to appreciate. There were technological changes, there were political changes, and as I like to say, as in politics and in nature, change is a constant. Things are always changing, and so you have to be ready to adjust to those changes based on your own values. And so the thing about NATO is that it's committed to democratic values. It's committed to mutual support and defense. And again, it came out of that experience where these alliances just happened based on, there was no real good reason. Nobody can to this day explain why countries lined up like they did. It just happened. And so NATO was an attempt, I think, to make some sense out of that, and to set up a rules-based kind of set of alliances, so that this didn't happen to us again. I say us meaning humanity. But and I hope that if anything, that we don't lose sight of the fact that NATO is rules-based and not personality-based, not who's your buddy, who's your friend. And the most important thing is that it does give us a framework for conflict resolution that is better, frankly, than just kind of having at it when a problem arises. Sure. And actually, the Ukraine, which you got into, which is kind of a good example, because the fact of the matter is that again, I'm giving you an American perspective here. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Russia invade Ukraine, and the rest of the world is sitting back saying, why is this happening? I mean, it makes, you can look at it and we can debate that for the rest of this conference. Sure. But the fact is that NATO does provide a platform on which these kinds of conversations can take place in the context of a rules-based system. And I think that's the most important value that it brings to this entire conversation, is that it's a way of managing change, which change always happens. And we need to be prepared on the front end to address it if we're going to survive as a species. And so I think that is really the challenge that we all face. And I'm happy to be here.
No, thank you so much. We'll certainly, I wrote down a few things there, and we'll certainly dive into a little bit more. Again, Ms. Braun, so happy to have you here. Mr. Ross, from your side, a little about yourself.
Yes.
Brought you into politics.
Thank you, Jacob and Catherine. I'm delighted to be here. And students, I will tell you, it is an absolute honor to be here with Senator Braun. She is a classic person of our American history. a tremendous ambassador for the United States, and actually has been an ambassador for the United States as well as a U.S. senator. So it's an honor, Senator, to be doing this with you. And I echo her concerns about the United Nations. I have had an interest in politics since I was a kid. I've been very blessed that I kept my focus on building a career as a lawyer, and then went through local, state, and then federal politics. My last term in Congress, I was getting a little concerned about our next generation of leaders, i.e. you guys, and how are they going to understand cooperative efforts because of the polarization that was not only going on in my country, but globally as well. And so I decided to leave Congress and go into the university setting and build a program that would focus on the necessity of not only civic engagement, but to also build a curriculum that would teach civil discourse and challenge people of diverse thought to come together, not necessarily to win your argument, but rather to build a relationship and hopefully a friendship. When I was in Congress, I had a chance to visit NATO for briefings. I had a chance to tour Germany, and I think I've never been to Stuttgart, believe it or not, but I've been just about everywhere else, and absolutely enjoy the geography, the culture, the people, and especially the food. So thank you for allowing me to be, and I look forward to this.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the brief history for both of you on where, kind of where you're from and how you got to where you're at. I wanted you mentioned something there, Mr. Ross, and maybe I'll kick this back to you because in my experience speaking with German students into the classrooms, the polarization is something that I get asked about a lot, particularly because the U.S. is what the U.S. is, and even on German news, we're a topic of discussion a lot, and I think in the age of technology that we have, you just hear more about what's happening inside of the U.S. and the polarization, the debate between Republicans and Democrats. I wanted to ask Mr. Ross, you said you had a concern about that in 2018. That's why you decided to go in a different direction. How do we make progress there? When we talk about Democrats versus Republicans and the divide, what needs to happen in order to get to a place in which you're legitimately hearing someone out from the other side and not trying to win an argument, just to build a relationship?
The first step is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's kind of like a weight loss program, and you've got to exercise self-discipline. If you want to have that lose weight, when you see that donut, you say, well, I'm just not going to eat that donut, but it takes discipline. If you want to blow up and lose your temper, you can't do that. You've got to exercise yourself to create some sense of self-discipline. More importantly, you've got to understand that we have to recognize the type of leaders we wish to have lead our countries. And then we need to elevate those elements of those leaders to a status where we say, we want statesman-like leadership. In the United States, when I was growing up, we actually revered some of our leaders. I mean, I even as a Republican, I thought, John Kennedy was awesome. I think that I think that, when you recognize that it's about facilitating the process by which policy can be vetted, that you become more of the leader that people want to see, instead of saying my policy is the way or no way, take it or leave it. Yeah. So we've got to, and this is what I'm working on now, is in local communities, create programs that recognize young people getting involved in the political process, elevate their stature, recognize them, don't denigrate them. And we live in a society where we denigrate Congress. Congress's, approval ratings in single digits. It's awful. But we've created that. And as a result, politics shouldn't be a top down, take it or leave it. It should be a bottom up, this is what we want. But it takes a generation to change that. That's why I'm in the university system, because I think I've collaborated with some universities throughout the country, building some programs. One of the programs, and I'll leave it at this, I'll be in Minnesota this next week with some universities. We've created a curriculum called Third Way Civics, which is a primary source civics and history lesson of United States. But it's primary source means there's no textbooks, there's nobody interpreting it. You learn from the documents right there. And then the methodology of teaching is that the students read some of these documents before class, answer some questions, and then they discuss it amongst themselves so they get an idea as to why they think the way they do. So you practice empathetic listening. And we're trying to build this in a university setting. So hopefully that we can, diffuse some of the polarization. That is that is an ideal that I'll probably never achieve, but it's a goal worth pursuing in my mind.
No, that's great. As a former teacher, Mr. Ross, the primary source documents, I always loved guiding with that. Document-based questioning, diving into it from that perspective. Ms. Braun, from your perspective, having been removed from Congress and now seeing the situation there, who am I to say that it's more polarized now than it once was? I don't know. Do you have anything to add there on how that relationship has to continue to work we have to work together to get to a place where Dems and Republicans are legitimately.
Is that it? Did it freeze? Oh, sorry. Are you still there, Jacob? What happened?
Yeah, I think probably he has connection problems, but I think he.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I think I fell off there a little bit. Ms. Braun, I was just wondering, from your perspective, having served and being removed from Congress now for a few years, what has to happen to continue to work together for Democrats and Republicans?
Well, let me say at the outset, I agree with Congressman Ross, and he really hit the nail on the head. And I wish there were more people that thought like he does in the Congress right now. Yeah. That's the beginning, to be respectful of the other person and to empathetic, to listen and to care about, to understand that it is a matter of you showing your respect of the other individual, that you listen to what they have to say and their perspective, their point of view. You can't just go into screaming at the opposition, if you will, or the person on the other side of the argument, because that just leads to more fracturing and polarization. So to work and policymaking can't take place in that kind of environment. The only way policymaking happens is if you can find common ground and find those things that you agree on. Yeah. And I think we have to move in that direction. I hope it's going to come. I hope the pendulum is going to swing back. Yeah. Again, I talk about change being one of the things that in politics and in nature is one of the things that's inevitable. Everything changes, and it changes all the time. And so I'm hoping that we'll get back to the day when people could talk to each other and work through problem solving, because that was the way it was. At least I was told that was the way it was before the recent times. And we have to go back to that if we're going to get, because there are huge problems facing the world. Not just talk about NATO, not just security issues and not just military issues, but we've got everything from climate change to, again, the well-being of our people. I mean, there should not be poverty and starvation in some parts of the community and ridiculous wealth on others. Yeah. I mean, you shouldn't have that. We have to work through these issues, and we have to work through them together, and we can't do that screaming. Yeah. It has to happen in the context of a respectful conversation and debate, and that recognizing that everybody's got a point of view and a perspective, and theirs is as valuable as yours is. Yeah. And so I hope we move in that direction. Yeah. I don't know what's going to happen to make it move in that direction. I think in the United States, at least, our politics has to change. And frankly, we have to change the way we finance campaigns, because that's a lot of what's driving this money. And so I don't know when, if that's going to happen, but I think we can all push toward that goal.
Okay. Yeah, some similar things there. And I think it's, as an American, refreshing to hear two former members discuss in that way the sense of how we reach an agreement, how we're supposed to collaborate with one another. Because the topic today is on NATO, and I just presented on it. I want to try to keep my questions as broad as possible, I guess, to make sure that we're staying aligned. But Mr. Ross, I guess I'll start back with you. What should be America's role with NATO? The history's there, but I mean, in your opinion or in your view, what is the role of the United States as it pertains to NATO?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously we supply the significant portion of materiel. We supply a significant portion of the dollars, but yet we must share the responsibility of coordinating our defense policies together. And there was a time back in the 60s when Charles de Gaulle, president of France, took France out of NATO because he felt that first of all, you had Americans were leading it, and then second in command was the British, and he felt that they were going to be third fiddle if anything were to happen with Russia. And so ultimately they jumped out and didn't get back in until 2009. So I think this issue has been addressed. Whether it's been resolved or not, I don't know. But it was a two-edged sword when President Trump was addressing NATO. He was identifying an issue that was at the forefront, and that was the 2% funding, 2% of GDP funding for the nations. But he was doing so in such a fashion that it was almost shaming nations to belong, and that doesn't have a good long-term effect. And so, the United States needs to continue in their role. But by default, there's nobody that's going to take United States position or a place in this. I mean, we are there by default because of we are the world superpower. They say the best form of government is a benevolent dictator. We just have to hope that the United States has some sense of benevolent in its administration. But again, you have to build the relationships. You don't intimidate the relationships in order to create them. And I think that's where the United States has to balance it, is they have to continue to nurture and build the relationships, especially with those that may be coming in, Finland and Sweden, as time goes on. So it's a delicate balance. We faced it before, and NATO has survived. But NATO hasn't really ever been tested other than 9/11. So we'll see, except right now, I guess, we're being tested.
Yeah, I'll piggyback. I'm going to go right back to Mr. Ross, and then I'll ask the same question to Ms. Braun, because we had a question from one of our groups here. They just asked, what is your party's position on this, and do you agree with that? So I know it's a bit tough because you guys are both, Mr. Ross, you're more recent inside of Congress. Do you feel like the Trump position were there were legitimate concerns for the majority of Republicans as it
I think he identified a legitimate concern of the United States in making sure that everybody paid their fair share, that it wasn't just the United States footing the bill in NATO. Now, the manner by which he did that, I would say that's a little questionable. And I don't subscribe to that particular type of leadership. But I think my party, which is still in a little bit of a state of flux as to what direction we're going in and who's leading us.
Very true.
I understand the significance, especially now with what's going on in Ukraine, and having a cohesive and strong NATO.
Yeah. Okay. And just to make sure that our students, I don't want to presume that you don't know this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I think it was 2006. If either of you can, 2006 though, students, there was an agreement as a part of NATO that there was a threshold that each country had to cross in military spending. It was aligned to their gross domestic product, and that number was 2%. 2% of your GDP had to go towards military spending, infrastructure spending. So that's what Mr. Ross is referencing there, and that's what former President Trump brought up at when he in 2018, 2019. That was a big portion of his discussion there. For you, Ms. Braun, we went from Trump to now Biden. I guess to get your opinion on what your party perceives as the role of America within NATO. Is that common thread? Do we see most Democrats are going to take the position of Biden, where we've had obviously a strengthening of relationships there, certainly trying to build with other countries? Do you think that reflects the larger party as a whole, that's the direction the Democrats want to move?
Well, I'm happy to report that I believe that President Biden has been focusing on preserving and protecting democracies around the world. And I think that's something that certainly every Democrat can embrace and get behind. How we protect democracies in this current environment is the question, obviously. It's always in details. And so as Representative Ross points out, it was legitimate concern that the United States was carrying the freight, carrying the weight for NATO and paying for it. And these other countries just kind of coming along for the ride and getting the benefit of NATO without supporting NATO. And I think that the fact that he came at it the way he did has raised the bar, raised the conversation. And so it's something that these other countries are now taking a look at. And so I don't know how many are still falling below 2% of the GDP in terms of their contribution to support NATO. But the fact of the matter is that everybody is aware that there's an expectation that this is not just the United States being policemen for the world, but if anything, that we are part of an alliance, which is what it's supposed to be, part of an alliance in which everybody pulls their own wagon and supports the operation in an equitable way. And so 2% may be an arbitrary number, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, what it does, it sets a floor in terms of what everybody, at least the minimum amount they should do. And so I don't know that has been achieved, but it certainly should be. And we can continue to press in that direction, again, as we insist on democratic values. And let me make one other point. The other value of NATO is that it's a rules-based system. It deals with change from a perspective that here is what we all kind of embrace, or what we all agree on. And I think that's really important, that we can start with something on which everybody agrees, and whether it's democracy or whatever the issue is, we need to have a starting place. And that's the real value of NATO, is that it gives us a starting place for that conversation and that collaboration.
Okay. I mentioned in my presentation, I think you, Representative Ross, I think you just got on right when I was mentioning this point. There's been a lot of talk about enlargement, adding additional countries. And I don't think us three are going to solve the issues with Russia on this call. But I would be curious to see, Representative Ross, do you see any, what pros and cons do you see, or in terms of, now you see Sweden, Finland being a part of it, potentially being added into NATO. Do we run any risks by continuing to add more countries to the group?
No question we run a risk. I mean, what we're seeing in Russia is a leader who has, in an unprovoked fashion, tried to regain the former status of the Soviet Union by going after his territories, and in doing so, threatening, the nuclear option or suggesting that may always be an alternative. I mean, we keep poking the bear. There's going to be a risk, in my opinion. However, what's the alternative? And I think that what we have to be able to do is plan for that risk and hope that diplomatically we can resolve the risk from ever coming to fruition. Adding the extra nations is probably necessary for their protection. In doing so, we become, vulnerable, if you will, to provocation by the Russians, and that provocation could easily be, a missile that lands in Poland, just even accidentally, and is that an attack on Poland that says, okay, now we all are in? So there is a risk. There's no question of risk, but you have to look at what's the alternative. And I think the alternative is that we lose ground for promoting democratic ideals throughout the world, which is one of the fundamental missions of NATO, and defending those democratic ideals.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Even when I put the slide deck together, I was, trying to become more informed on what was happening. It didn't seem like there was like one straight, hey, this action is not going to have any ramifications that you would have to deal with. Obviously, the addition of countries for safety, but does that provoke Russia and threaten them and make them feel like they're getting closer and closer to NATO? You kind of get back into old East and West Germany stuff.
Right.
What was happening in the mid 1950s with that as well.
Yeah, my feeling is that if we keep pushing Russia, we're going to put them in a corner, and we've got to give them some form of exit strategy so that they don't feel that they have to take the last resort option.
Yeah. Ms. Braun, anything from your side there? I think clearly this may not represent your values, but we have a Democratic president and President Biden now that taken a very different approach to Russia than the former President Trump did in terms of the relationship side and what we're doing there. Obviously, the Ukraine conflict has made that much more complicated. But what are your thoughts there on how do we handle that with Russia? You have all these countries that want to be added, but you run the risk of maybe, as Representative Ross said, backing them into a corner.
Well, let me say this. The one point, a point that I didn't raise, I'm now a grandmother of twins.
Okay.
They're 4.
Okay.
And so I went to visit the babies yesterday, and the school down the street from them has blue and yellow ribbons tied on the fence all the way around the school. I thought it was really interesting because if the support for Ukraine is that at that level, at the school down the street from my baby's house, then quite frankly, what that means is that there's tremendous support in this country for the plight of the Ukrainian people. Now, is that going to back Russia in a corner? Well, the fact of the matter is we need to give them an out, that's where they can save face. We need to make sure, NATO needs to make sure that the Russians don't feel that their back is up against the wall, because nobody makes a good decision in those kinds of circumstances. But without losing sight of the values that we are embracing, which again has to do with democratic institutions, which has to do with mutual defense. And I just hope that we can move forward, again, find a way out for the Russians, assuming for a moment they want it. I mean, we don't know what Mr. Putin wants to do, quite frankly. And yesterday I was really kind of, in addition to seeing the blue and yellow ribbons on the school, I came back and to the news and saw that they're even doing nuclear drills in New York. It's like, everybody's getting the state of terror around what could happen has been growing. So, and I'm here, I live like within walking distance of the University of Chicago. And this is where they have what's called the doomsday clock, when they talk about nuclear annihilation of our planet. Again, we cannot go down that road. NATO gives us a fail-safe or a way to avoid that kind of response to all these issues that are always changing. I mean, today it's Ukraine, but tomorrow maybe somewhere else. We just don't know. But the fact of the matter is we have to be sure that we do what we can in our time to protect those institutions that give us a possibility of peace.
I've read a little bit about that as well. Some of the schools implementing more drills, if you will, and that definitely brought me back. I've just taught about that in my high school class around you're building your bomb shelters, right? In the 50s and 60s, they're big during the Red Scare. You had
my dad had a bomb shelter in our backyard. It was the scariest thing. And it's like, who's going to eat that food after 20 years?
You got all that stuff. I remember you buy them in the magazine. You pick one out and have it installed. There's one more question that just came through from one of the classes. It says, do you think that the expansion of NATO has triggered the war in Ukraine as Russia feels increasingly threatened? Either one of you, it's totally up to you.
The short answer is no, it hasn't.
Okay.
The timeline, the fact of the matter is the application of Finland to join NATO didn't come until after the Russians had invaded Ukraine. I mean, months after. And so quite frankly, I don't know, it's a chicken and egg kind of conversation, but I don't think that one has anything to do with the other in that regard.
Okay.
No, I agree. I agree.
Okay. Yeah, I think that area in general has always been a bit of contention with the annexation of Crimea. I think that was in 2013 or 2014 where Russia came in and annexed Crimea. And then obviously the ongoing conflict there where the eastern portion of the country has been sort of quasi at war, battling with Ukrainian forces inside of there. But that trying to answer the question there for my class that asked. I wanted to get a little bit more technical, if you guys don't mind. As a former congressman, as a former senator, what is your role as it relates to something like NATO? what does a senator do as it means to the relationship there? What does a congressman do, Representative Ross? What does that look like, or what did that look like for you within your role when you were in Congress?
Several times I would travel with a small delegation of members of Congress, bipartisan members of Congress, to go and we would either do a briefing in Brussels or then go and visit some of our bases over there to discuss our relationship with NATO. We'd brief with some of our NATO allies at the State Department, things of that nature. And a lot of that's just to see our readiness. What is our readiness like? Two, what is our cooperation like? Three, what type of drills, if you will, are they doing in order to be prepared for defense? Then we always have debates. If there's we move a missile defense system out of one country that we feel that it makes them now vulnerable, so we have debates in Congress on the floor about why we did that and how we do that. Absent a law that's actually passed and signed by the president, we really have to delegate everything to the NATO command to let them do what they do. But we're like a board of directors. So we would say, okay, why are you doing this? And then we would debate whether it's good or bad. Okay.
Ms. Braun, anything to add from your side there and your experience?
The Senate obviously does the confirmations, but in addition to that, people pick out what areas they want to focus in on. And when I was in the Senate, I did not focus in on the NATO countries. I focused on another part of the world. Okay. But the fact of the matter is that, and I didn't take any trips. As much as I would like to have, I didn't do that. And so we are involved with providing, as Representative Ross used the term, board of directors. And so we are kind of a board of directors too. And the Senate does play an outsized role when it comes to foreign relations.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's always interesting. It's sometimes, even when I was teaching in the US, the day-to-day stuff for a member of Congress is always, what do they actually, I see they're on this committee, but what does that mean? And I see that they're on this committee, what does that mean? So I appreciate that, just giving some insights to the German students on what your day-to-day look like as it relates to NATO. To maybe widen the conversation here a little bit, we have maybe 20 minutes or so left, and I want to make sure we get to some questions as well. I want to go back just a tad bit, and I think as it relates to anybody in Europe and or the rest of the world, the United States took a bit of a different approach under Donald Trump with sort of an America First policy, if you will. This was more about taking care of us inside of the U.S. And there was a question that was provided beforehand. It said, do you think that the U.S. has sort of benefited from that America First policy? And I'm curious, what are your thoughts there? I know it's a big question to answer, but I'm sure that there's a couple different ways you can. But Ms. Braun, go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you called on me because I've got to take my alarm system off. the workers are coming. I told you about how on the construction. Where there's not plastic, there's dust. Yeah. So. But anyway, the workers are here. But just briefly, I don't know that America First does serve our interests. Quite frankly, we can't, no man is an island, no country is an island. And even though I represented an island nation, the fact of the matter is these relationships are so interrelated. There's nothing we can do to free ourselves from what happens in Europe. During the First World War, back to that. Yeah. During the First World War, there were a lot of Americans who were saying, that's Europe's problem. We don't need to get involved with that. But the fact of the matter is that what happens in Europe matters greatly in the United States. And you can't protect the United States unless you protect what's going on in the rest of the world. And so it is in our interest, both short-term and long-term interest, to engage with NATO, to engage with these international organizations, to try to provide what influence and support we can to the conversations so that we can protect our interests without isolating ourselves. And so that's kind of where I come out on that. Okay. And I'm going to go open the door.
Okay, no problem. Mr. Ross, Representative Ross, from your side, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two issues here. There's leadership issues, and then there's political gain issues. And America First is a nationalist way of saying We want you guys to disregard others. We're the team. Get on the team. It's all about us. But yet, when I was in college taking economics, I learned that self-sufficiency breeds inefficiency, meaning that if all you try to do is become self-sufficient, you become inefficient because you don't have the resources to be totally self-sufficient. You have to rely on other nations for other resources, other goods, other services, and that you have to have an interdependent relationship. While our founding father, George Washington, felt that the United States should be an isolationist and not concern themselves with others. We do the Monroe Doctrine. We do all kinds of things to say, hey, we're going to protect our interests first. And it's a good political mantra to have to rally people around. And I think that worked extensively well for the Trump campaign. But in reality, you've got to have, especially in a global economy that we now exist in, you've got to have interdependent relationships. And so, putting America first may get you elected. I don't know if it'll keep you elected if you want to develop relationships with other nations and be able to sustain an economy that's affordable. Because again, if you think you can do it all yourself, you're going to become very inefficient. And so you've got to have these relationships. It's more of a political move than it is a practical move in today's economy, in today's technology, where the world is essentially flat.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the globalization, you can't really rewind that. We've reached a certain point where we're so interconnected. And I think your point around electability versus execution of such a plan is really important for the German students here. While President Trump was the president here in Europe, you heard different headlines all the time, and that's what was getting picked up. That's sort of the electability portion of what the former president was about. In terms of the execution, it's just one thing versus the other, I think. So that's a really good point. I have one more sort of general question, and then I'm going to see if we have any more Q&A submitted. Having both of you well-traveled, been around the world, Representative Rossi has been to Germany, a couple other places. Ms. Braun, you having a chance to travel when you were younger. The relationship between Germany and the U.S. is, I think, always been one that's interesting for me as someone who's from the United States and now lives in Germany. We had a question submitted. It said, how do you assess the friendship between Germany and the United States right now? What do you think? What would be your thoughts to that when you hear that question? How would you assess the friendship between Germany and the U.S.?
I would point out that my last name is Braun. So, from my perspective, I think it's a very solid relationship. Obviously, there's the economic competition, which is not going to stop. But at the same time, on the political front, particularly under Ms. Merkel, I don't know what's going to be going forward, but she did a lot to open up a conversation between our countries, and she was a real steady hand. I think that's what we need a lot more of, Mr. Ross, steady hands. Instead of beating a drum and setting up a circus kind of atmosphere and parade, we need somebody who understands that the world is interdependent, that we have to make friends, that we have to have allies, and that we have to work together, again, in behalf of the people. Because remember, all this politics, at the end of the day, comes down to how well are you providing for the people? I mean, the whole idea of democratic institutions is that this is a government by the people and for the people. And so we must not forget the for the people and of the people as we go forward and do what we can to, again, address these issues, these real life issues that people care about. The people want to live in peace and in safety. They want to educate their kids. They want to provide opportunities. I mean, the ambitions are the same no matter where in the world you are. And I have traveled extensively. I haven't given you, Jacob, my complete itinerary, but I've traveled extensively around the world, and it's the same everywhere. People speak differently, but they want the same stuff. And so how well governments are doing to provide those things is the issue, and that's the litmus test on all of this.
Anything
Well
from your
put.
side? Yeah, I was gonna.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it also further, accentuates why the relationship between the U.S. and Germany is so important. And I think that Chancellor Scholz, who is more liberal than his predecessor, really surprised people when they opened up when they decided to get to turn off Nord Stream, when they decided to become more interested in nuclear that they haven't. I mean, who would have guessed that? But it's also, I think that's part of the give and take relationship that they have with the U.S. and the common goal of making sure that Russia doesn't get the better hand of this. I mean, that was a very difficult political move for an incoming chancellor to do that. But I think in doing so, he showed strong leadership in behalf of not only the German people, but also of the EU and NATO. And I mean, that's pretty impressive. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. We've had a relationship with Germany ever since, I think it was John Quincy Adams was the first Secretary of State, or the first ambassador to Germany. But it's a long-standing good relationship. Like any relationship, it's a bit of a roller coaster.
Yeah, well put. I wanted to ask, every time we have these, I think it's important that I try to let the students pick your brain a little bit. And so it's going to be a question to both of you. What advice would you give to one of these students here in Germany? It's a bit different because they're here and we're from the United States, but you're both obviously very successful in your careers, in your personal and professional lives. Something that I think, I told Miss Braun that I remember teaching about her in my classroom. It's really neat. What piece of advice can you give to a 16, 17-year-old today that you'd want to pass along? So Miss Braun, maybe we can start with you.
I would say stay curious and be courageous. Those two things put together. Curiosity about the world around you. This world is so vast and so different that you never stop learning. And so if you stay curious and you're courageous enough to believe in yourself and believe in in your dreams, if you can do those two things, you'll be fine. Life is not just roller coaster, it goes in lots of different directions. You may I started out to be an art historian. I couldn't be further from that, right? But at the same time, this journey that I've been on, and by the way, I'm not dead yet. That's a joke.
Yeah.
They named a school after me, and two little boys were walking down the hall, and one turned around and said, "Hey, there goes Carol Mosley Braun," and the other kid said, "Oh, you mean she's not dead yet?" So it's not over yet, but the journey has been really fascinating. It's taken me in places that I never would have expected. But again, if you are courageous and you believe in yourself and you want to do the right thing, you will be fine. Good
advice. Representative Ross, what about you?
First of all, you all are going to be leaders, or have the opportunity to be leaders faster than you know. Your generation is in search of leaders. Find good people to emulate. And I think Senator Braun is a fantastic person if you have any interest in becoming a leader, and to emulate her upbringing, because it shows somebody who comes from, especially at a time in United States history when African Americans were having a very difficult time rising to the top and being able to be given the opportunities to exude leadership, and to see how well she's done, and you have. And I'm not being condescending. I'm being very honest here. I think it shows that you have the opportunity from any means, from any ethnic background, to be a leader who seeks to make your community better than it is. And the last thing I'll tell you is to build relationships with people of diverse thought. And what I mean by that is, don't try to convince them that you're right. Try to build the relationship for friendship purposes, because whomever may be your adversary today may need to be your ally tomorrow, and you're going to need that relationship.
Good advice. Solid from both of you. Appreciate that. I wanted to leave enough time just in case we had any Q&A that I didn't get to. So I do think I have one question here. It's getting a little bit back more into the topic that we were just covering, which is okay. It says, do you think that China will become a bigger threat for NATO countries in the future? I didn't cover this too much in my presentation class, so I appreciate this question, because there has been a shift from NATO's perspective. Even in their past, the conference in Madrid just recently, they talked about, more focus on Asia as we've started to try to stabilize to a certain degree within the Western European region. So I'll offer that up to either of you. Do you think that China will become a bigger threat for NATO countries in the future?
Well, let me say this. Again, starting with a rules-based order, the chances of China embracing democratic values and democratic ideals and democratic ways of doing things are slimmer than the Russians doing it. I mean, the problem is that we have there are countries, huge countries on the planet that do not appreciate the notion of democracy. And so if democracy is what we're promoting with NATO, then the chances of China being a greater threat in future are pretty good, actually. And so but we can't, Congressman Ross hit the nail on the head. You got to make friends where you can, because you never know, because change is so constant. You never know that whether or not what will happen tomorrow, what the Chinese are going to do, or what the Russians are going to do. We just don't know. And so none of us have a crystal ball. So the best we can do is to engage with people in a respectful way, engage with nations in a respectful way, recognizing that they have the same aspirations for their people that we have for ours.
Amen.
And we, if we go forward with that with that notion, I believe we'll be fine.
Yes. And I concur. China is going to continue to be a greater threat, and they're making their investments in third world countries. They're putting in infrastructure. They're putting in, utilizing their resources, whether they be, oil, whether it be precious metals. They're taking, the South China Sea. They're developing the dredging and building bases or islands for potential bases. Western Africa, they're investing there, so they're getting a presence not only in the South Pacific but also in the Atlantic. So yes, and as the senator pointed out, it's highly unlikely they're ever going to embrace democratic ideals. And so they will continue to be a greater and greater threat. I think they're learning from what happened in Ukraine, and it's just going to take more time for them to be prepared to want to take us on.
Yeah. I think for the students here, again, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but some of the initial concern around the spread of communism from the Soviet Union was based on what was happening in China at that time. They referred to that as the domino theory, that, in Asia, it was China's spread was implementing those styles of government. And so that was another thing that supplemented or heightened a fear that was going to happen in Europe as well from what was happening inside of Asia, in China specifically. And I couldn't agree more with you too. I think there's culturally, having someone who's been decently well-traveled, it's just very different from China to, most of the places. I laugh here in Germany. I'm from a small Midwestern town in Southern Illinois, but there are things that are very similar to the town that I grew up in and the town that I live here in Stuttgart. I almost laugh the similarities, but I don't think you'd find as many of those things in a country like China. And that obviously, I think, creates potential tension down the road. So, okay.
We're in Southern Illinois. Where are you from?
I grew up in a small town, Trenton.
Okay. Murfreesboro? Do you have familiar with Murfreesboro?
Wow. Red Devils, Mr. Ross.
Yeah.
I played them high school football, played the Murfreesboro Red Devils.
Yeah. Great town. And of course, Southern Illinois University, the Salukis and all that there.
Yeah. Look at that. Wow. What a connection that is.
Yes.
Okay. So we're at about 9 minutes. I think I always try to make sure I leave enough time. I don't see any additional Q&A. To both of you, Senator Ms. Braun, Representative Ross, I mean, what a cool opportunity for me to get a chance to speak with both of you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know the students do too. And I think we got a good conversation on something that's current and it's relevant. And what I'm starting to hear, Catherine, when we meet with some of these former members of Congress is the idea of collaboration and working together. I think it's a little easier to find in some of you than it is in the current Congress that's in place. But I think it does speak to where your values are at, and hopefully we can see that as we move forward. So, Catherine, I just want to say thank you to both of our guests. Thank you to you,
Thank
but
you.
I'll go ahead and I'll toss it back over to you to close everything out.
Yeah, all I can do is thank you both for being here. It was really a pleasure listening to you, to discussing things and also seeing different perspectives, but still, you know, approaching these topics from a point of view that you want to work together, collaborate, that you both find these things so important. That I think that's a really good message for the students as well, to show them that there are people who are willing to work together, because as Jacobs already said, you know, the picture we get at the moment is this polarized America, and I think that's not the only thing that's happening, and there's still another picture and another way to approach things. And I think we got a great glimpse of that today. I think we got some really interesting insights in your work in Congress, but also on the topic of NATO and all the different aspects of it. So I think it was great. For me, it was awesome. I'm happy to get some feedback from the students as well. So if you want to send us some feedback and let us know how you like the discussion, we're happy to get that. And thank you so much again, Senator Mosley Braun, Representative Ross, thank you for being here. And I also want to thank the former members of Congress again for putting this together and bringing us together here. Thank you so much for your help in organizing this. And I really hope to see everyone soon again for maybe another discussion on another topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank
Bye.
you, Senator.
Everyone,
Bye-bye.
have a great day. Bye.